Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. August marks 4 years since I launched Civics and Coffee. I still can't believe that I get to share my passion for history with you, and I am humbled and honored that so many of you come back each and every week. In trying to decide the best way to celebrate the anniversary, I thought I would release some bonus episodes. So, in addition to my normal Saturday fare, I am also releasing extra episodes every Wednesday in August, giving you a double dose of the show. I also have a major announcement coming at the end of the month that you won't want to miss. For the first bonus episode, I sat down with junior scholar Ethan Healey. You may remember Ethan as he was a previous guest of the show. He is currently working toward his graduate degree and recently wrote about prior episode topic James Baldwin. We sat down over a cup of coffee and chatted about who James Baldwin was and how his overseas travel influenced his understanding of race and his identity. We recorded our conversation over Zoom, so I'm inserting my standard sound quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, joining me today is Ethan Healey. He is a history teacher and a graduate student from New Hampshire and is currently working toward his master's degree in United States history, where he focuses on early America and the early American Republic. And in proving that historians are multifaceted, Ethan is here actually to talk about a prior topic on the show, the talented and prolific James Baldwin. Welcome, Ethan.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
I know, welcome back. It's so good to see you.
Good to be back.
And let's dive in. You shared some work with me that really talks about James Baldwin and his evolving sense of identity through his transatlantic experiences. So, before we get into all of that, how did you first encounter Baldwin?
So I first encountered James Baldwin with an interview that he did with Dick Cavett, and I'm a big fan of the Dick Cavett show. I really wish we still had somebody like Dick Cavett around. But anyway, Dick Cavett had James Baldwin on, and he also had another professor, one of his former Yale professors on. And in that podcast, or in that interview, sorry, he did a whole really long discussion on race relations in America. And this was in the 50s. So it was right before kind of, everything like really starts to kick off. And then he brings this Yale professor out, and the Yale professor, they kind of have large philosophical disagreements about the race relations in America. And you can find it on YouTube. But that's where I first discovered James Baldwin. And I was amazed at the way he spoke to me was just so beautiful, and everything he said was so poetic. And I started to wanting to learn more about him. So watched the documentary "I Am Not Your Negro," and that is a phenomenal documentary, which we'll talk a little bit about. But yeah, so my encounter with James Baldwin happened a few years earlier. Started on YouTube through just looking through the archives on YouTube, and that's where I discovered him, and he's been a fascinating figure to me ever since.
An example of how the internet can be a power for good.
Exactly. That's right.
And then in your work, you reviewed several Baldwin texts to frame your argument. So how and why did you land on the work cited throughout your analysis?
Yeah, so there's a couple of texts that I chose, and the first text I chose was "Notes of a Native Son," and really the text that I chose are chronological. And as a historian, it's a lot easier for me to analyze things in chronological order. And I try to analyze things in that fashion. And really, what I wanted to try to do with that essay that I sent you was I wanted to identify the ideas that James Baldwin was heavily influenced from his time abroad. because he is an individual who lives in Paris for pretty much 40 years. And these texts that I chose, the five texts that I chose, really set the stage for why he does that. And the first text is in the 1950s, and then the next one is the early 60s. And it really shows his long progression of how he changes his thoughts. And I always find that interesting because when he first writes Notes of a Native Son, he's kind of thinking about these, really large scale race ideas, and he's just putting his thoughts on paper. And then as he gets along, his views become, I don't know if you'd say more mature, but they become more analytical, more philosophical. Like any you could tell that he grows as he goes along. So the reason why I started with or used those texts was mostly because of chronological order, and I wanted to see his progression of this is how he starts from, you know, sort of his most famous essay, Notes of a Native Son, or essays, to really the last one, which is the documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, which was released in 2017.
Yeah. And speaking of kind of the earliest evolution, let's start with Notes of a Native Son.
Mhm.
In Notes of a Native Son, what does Baldwin identify as the differences between Paris and the United States?
Right. So in Notes of a Native Son, James Baldwin writes about wanting to escape the United States. That is the words that he uses. He feels like the United States is an insane asylum, and he repeatedly throughout Notes of a Native Son uses the word escape. I needed to escape the United States. I needed to escape the United States. And Paris, to him, he realized that Paris was a place where a lot of people romanticized it. And he wanted to see for himself whether it really was this true romantic, place that everybody talked about. And it turns out that that was not true. It was not as romantic as he envisioned it from films and books and other things that he read. But he really enjoyed the culture and the art there. But the major difference for James Baldwin was the black and white race relations was non-existent, in the sense that that massive dichotomy was not there. It was not black or white. You were just simply, it was more about being an American more than anything. And he was criticized for being an American living in Paris more than he was the idea of being a black man in Paris. So that was a change for him. And he didn't have a lot of money, so he was labeled as just a poor American man, which he thought, this is just a different kind of prejudice. This is a different feeling that I'm encountering. And he really felt that instead of being prejudice against the color of your skin, now you're just being prejudiced against being a member of the working class. And he talks about that in Notes of a Native Son, and that transitional period for him, and how Paris is different in the United States in that people were not fearful of a black man. And that really struck out to me, that he said that people were not fearful in Paris of a black man, but they didn't want to invoke friendship amongst black people either. So for Baldwin, he goes over there thinking it's going to be a lot different, and he overwhelmingly does not realize that it is going to be similar yet very, very different in the sense of the prejudices that he's going to experience there, which
Yeah.
was surprising to me.
And it's very clear, I think, anybody who's even remotely familiar with Baldwin, that he does have this kind of love-hate relationship with the United States, right? He left Paris in order to escape the United States. He was very forcefully critical of the United States and its handling of race relations. So, how does this love-hate relationship with the United States that Baldwin has kind of contribute to his understanding of how Black people are viewed both at home and abroad?
This is something that comes up all the time in his works, all the time, about his relationship with America. And that's why this project became so interesting for me to study and research James Baldwin. Because as you said in the beginning, like I'm an early American historian, like I live in early America, But James Baldwin, I knew that I needed to research more about him, and there was something more about him that I needed to figure out. And his identity, American identity in general, is something very interesting to me. So how he relates to that. And I think the conclusion that I've come to is I don't think Baldwin hates America. I think he really does love America. I mean, the most famous quote I think that he has, and I quote it repeatedly to, people who I'm less politically inclined with, that, and I wrote down the quote. He says, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." And that is at the very beginning of Notes of a Native Son, actually. And I think that is in his prologue, and that sets the entire tone for the rest of all of the essays that I read. And so I think he realized that because he loves America so much, it's the reason why he criticizes her so perpetually. He also realizes that he talks a lot about his ancestors, and that's one of the reasons why he really enjoys and does love America, because he knows the hard work that it took for his ancestors to give him the life that he had. So he was very well aware of all of these things. And there are a lot of critics of James Baldwin who felt that him going to Paris was a cop out for everything, that he didn't want to experience, being an African American in the American community, and that leaving and going to Paris was something of a of a way to dodge what was actually going on. And that's something that he considers heavily when he thinks about coming back to America, which, is something that he eventually does later on.
Yeah. And shifting gears into the second text that you looked at, what does Baldwin describe as the quote real attitude of the white world, end quote, in his collection Nobody Knows My Name?
So Nobody Knows My Name is the second source that I looked at, and Nobody Knows My Name is really an analysis. So the Notes of a Native Son is the transition into Paris, and Nobody Knows My Name is discussing Paris, his life in Paris, and then him coming home to New York City, where he grew up. And he grew up in Harlem. And that quote that you read, "the real attitude of the white world," is a reference to the creation of what he calls the New York City projects, right? Which you would call the affordable housing developments that are created and run by the city. And Baldwin describes these real attitude of the white world as just another way to segregate Black people from the communities. It was a way to put African Americans in another community, segregate them away from where all of the richer, more working class white people lived in New York City. And he considered it, the second half of that is really a massive consideration of how these affordable housings, he calls them colorless and cheerless as a prison. And he knows that they do that for a reason. And he criticizes the idea that they were created to segregate Black people away, and that it was just merely another way of control for the New York City government, for Harlem. And more than anything, he considers the affordable housing units as an insult to his intelligence. He says that at the very, very end of that essay, that point blank period, this is an insult to my intelligence. It's an insult to who I am. And he feels that he doesn't, you know, him and what he calls his people are non-deserving of something like that. So that real attitude of the white world just shows that, like, even if people are considering the idea that, Black people should be integrated into the world, they still really are creating these massive projects. And he just saw it as another way of segregation.
Yeah, and kind of looking at comparing notes and Nobody Knows My Name, how are these two similar in how Baldwin analyzes race, and where does he draw the line?
So Notes and Nobody are very similar in that he really talks about his Black identity for the first time, and how he thinks of himself as a Black man. And as I said before, Notes discusses Baldwin's largely transition into Paris life, and nobody discusses why he returns to America. And he returns to America because of a stabbing that occurs with Martin Luther King. Somebody stabbed Martin Luther King at a bookstore at a book signing, and Baldwin ultimately responds to this with disgust and despair, and he says, "Maybe it's time that I go back. Maybe it's time that I go back, and I live in that world again, where I go away from where nobody knows my name to America where everybody knows my name." And obviously that's a metaphor because not everybody knows his name, but the metaphor is that he's now this massive label. And the how they're similar is Notes of a Native Son is this getting away from the label, and nobody knows my name is coming back into that label where he becomes just so back into the culture of America in the late 1950s, early 60s at that point.
Moving into your third text, in what ways does Baldwin outline the blatant racism his nephew should prepare for in The Fire Next Time?
So The Fire Next Time is probably his most famous work. It's probably the one that you're going to see on the bookshelves most often when look for James Baldwin in a bookstore. This is probably the book that you're going to see, and there's a reason for that. There's two essays that James Baldwin does. The first is a letter directly to his nephew that he wrote in 1963, which is 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And he writes this letter openly to his nephew and really outlines, he's just so open and honest. It's probably the most open that Baldwin is in his writing, because it's a letter, it's more personal. He's not writing to a general audience, he's writing specifically to his nephew. I have a quote here from that essay, and he says to his nephew, "You were born where you were born and faced the future that you faced because you were black and for no other reason. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways as possible that you were a worthless human being." End quote. And that he wants to prepare for his nephew that racism exists. You are going to experience it as a black man, and that you need to engage with this brutality very early on in your life, because Baldwin, I think, wrote this in an effort to not only discuss the 100 years of emancipation and really say that very little has changed. Like, we're free, yes, but the feelings that we feel are still the racism that it still exists, and you're still gonna have to deal with it and still gonna have to go through it. And it's not long. It's not a long essay at all. I actually really encourage everybody to go read it because it is a very well crafted letter, and it's a brutal letter, but he just tells his nephew in The Fire Next Time that you're going to experience racism, and you're going to go through it, so prepare for it
Yeah.
now.
Well, and think considering the context, right? 1963. So this is before the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. So in that realm, right, Baldwin has a strong argument for saying, yeah, we're free in kind of name only, right? There's lots of things that we don't have access to. There's lots of ways that we are kind of discriminated against and held back in a society that supposedly had freed us 100 years ago. So,
Absolutely.
and how does The Fire Next Time illuminate Baldwin's perceptions on the influence of religion on his identity?
So this is where the essay where he talks about religion and how his initial intention when he was younger was he was going to become a pastor because that's what his father did. His father was a pastor, and he felt like he had to live up to that name, and he felt like he had to follow in his parents' footsteps, and his dad's footsteps a lot. And really, more than anything, this is an essay about his father. More than anything, this is an essay about It's for sure the most autobiographical out of all of the texts that I looked at, because he really goes from kind of the beginning of his life to the development of religion and how that influences his identity, which is probably why it's the most popular, because it gives a really good overview of his life and this kind of development of how he goes from wanting to be a pastor to just not wanting anything to do with religion at all. And he obviously begins, when he's very young, he goes to see his father, and he goes to see his father preach. And as he gets older, he starts to realize that this influence of God may not be as influential as he thinks it is. And he comes to the conclusion that ultimately religion, religion and racism have very similar ideologies, which is very interesting to me because he says that both created the illusion of kind of a space to explore one another and explore each other, but ultimately he calls it a meaningless meanings. Religion is a meaningless meanings. That it's all talk and no game, essentially. That they do all of these things, they talk about all these things, but at the end of the day, nobody ever puts forth what they're actually talking about. So that's his main criticism of religion, and the fact that he really pushes these ideas away. And once he gets to Paris, religion and his mind are totally gone. I wouldn't say he's an atheist, but I would say that he definitely does not believe in the God that his father believed in. And I would say that religion pushed him away from wanting to believe in something that didn't accept him. And ultimately that is his reason for not wanting to even go through with that anymore, and why he chose to not be a pastor and why he chose to just write.
Yeah. And one of the other texts that you looked at is a series of correspondence between Maya Angelou and Baldwin. And so, what were some of the things that Maya Angelou and Baldwin were protesting in their letters with each other?
Yeah, so this is an interesting correspondence that they have with one another, and they actually have an interview as well that is very illuminating, very beautiful, and if you have heard Maya Angelou before, Maya Angelou also has this gorgeous voice. She has a beautiful, soft tone. The way she speaks is beautiful. So contrast that to Baldwin. It's so similar. Their voices are so similar in the sense of it's truthfully the most calming like interview you will hear, but it is so beautiful the way they talk. So in this, they talk about the role of activism in their community and how they both. So James Baldwin is not just an essayist; he's also a fiction author. He writes fiction, and I've never read his fiction. To be fair, I've just tried to focus on the essays more so for this project. But in the fiction, they deal with a lot of activism roles, and Maya Angelou, very similar, writes fiction, writes poetry, deals with a lot of activism roles. So they both come from the place of being writers. And that I think is why more than anything they get along so well, is because they're both writers. They know what it feels like to be a Black writer. They know what it feels like to try to understand your identity through writing. And that's really what they talk about more than anything. And Maya Angelou actually says that she understands why James Baldwin went to Paris, why he went to Europe, why he needed to go to Europe, in order to connect a deeper identity to yourself and in order to connect a deeper identity to being an American. And they talk about the love-hate relationship, and that the reason why they stayed in America is because, again, he brings up the idea that their ancestors are the reason why they're there, and they knew that this was very, very important for them, and that Angelo specifically feels that Baldwin needed to go to Europe to discover himself as a writer, that it made him a stronger writer in hindsight. Baldwin ultimately agreed that that is what needed to happen. It's a beautiful conversation that they have with each other.
And in Not Your Negro, Baldwin is shown discussing the role of family. And so, how does this connect with his activism?
So this is ultimately why he returns to America. He returns to America for his family. He realizes in Paris that he's deeply, deeply missed his family, that his family is the one thing that connects him back to everything. And in the documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, which is on various streaming platforms that you can find, family is home. Family is home to him. And while he has severe disagreements with his father, his mother and his sisters and his brothers are the things that kind of keep him keep him alive. And his brothers and sisters talk a lot about, wanting him to come home, and that you need to come home, you need to come back and live with us. And he obviously says, I don't want to come back. I have no interest in coming back. And ultimately, that documentary really tries to outline how Baldwin's family helps to, well, one of the pieces of the documentary helps outline why Baldwin needed to come home for his family. The race stuff and the civil rights movement absolutely inspires him to help him come back home. But it's ultimately his family that convinces him to say, I'm gonna go back home, and I'm gonna go through, and I'm gonna live life.
Yeah, and activism is personal, right? So tying it to the family and giving him that push to get involved. And he was prolific and wrote predominantly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He's since passed away, but I think there's an argument to be made that his thoughts on race are still relevant. So, Penny, for your thoughts, how do you think Baldwin's thoughts and opinions and essays on race are still relevant today in the United States?
Well, the documentary I Am Not Your Negro is originally his last writing project was originally going to be a analysis of how he experienced three assassinations of three major Black icons. And that was Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Medgar Evers was another one. All three he knew personally. So his last writing project was going to be about how really an essay or a novel. I'm not sure how exactly he was gonna form it, because he only got about 30 pages in, but it was going to be about this analysis of how those assassinations really reflect the current issues of what would have been the 1980s. And I think the argument, James Baldwin and his work is incredibly relevant, because I think if you were to read Baldwin's work and you are somebody of a mind who understands that the race relations in America in 2024 are still not great, there's still so much work to do in activism, in protest, and that his ideas are still very much relevant if you were to go back and you read them. And it's really interesting to me how something that was written in 1955 can be just as relevant today as it was then. And the other piece, and this is something my project doesn't really tackle very much, because I wanted to focus on his Black identity, but he's also a gay man, and he is somebody who has kind of developed as part of the LGBTQ plus community, for the fact that he was a gay Black man going through all of these civil rights pieces. And he doesn't really talk about him being a queer man very much until later in his life, when it becomes more prominent in the 1980s, right? These discussions of AIDS and all of these things. And that's when he feels like it's a good time to start talking about his sexuality. And everybody or not everybody, but a lot of people question his sexuality. And anytime people ask him about it in the early years, in the 60s, 50s and 60s, he just brushes it off and says, well, that's, we're not really here to talk about that issue. So he's the discussions that he was talking about, the race pieces that he was talking about are all still massively relevant in 2024, massively relevant, mostly especially because his prose is also so readable. Like if we're just talking about not, we're not talking about the content, the prose is beautiful. So if for anything else, go to read Baldwin to read his prose because it is excellent, and you really learn a lot about the Black experience. And he also takes it from a different perspective of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers, because Baldwin's a writer. He is not an individual who was on the picket lines. He was not an individual who protested with violence. He was not an individual who protested in film. He was not out there protesting in a big crowd. He sat at home and he wrote, and that was his form of protest. I think there's something in that. I think it's probably also why James Baldwin is not as discussed in the larger scale of civil rights icons. I think it's becoming more so. But I think his influence and his work, his writing, is what makes him part of that conversation as somebody you need to know and discuss in the sense of the civil rights movement. Very long-winded, I know, but need to get it all out there.
And you kind of answered this in your previous answer, but I do want to just give you an opportunity to expand if you want to in are there how did Baldwin kind of use his writing to contribute to Black activism?
I think Baldwin felt that it was all he could do at the very end. I don't think he felt truly, I don't think he felt comfortable being an organizer. He didn't feel comfortable being a politician. He didn't feel comfortable, doing these really large scale speeches either. He does have several speeches that he does, and he does the speaking engagements, but he's not really even comfortable with the idea. He has a debate about race relations. And this is a very famous debate with William F. Buckley Jr. And if you know anything about William Buckley, you know that you really kind of have the two sides of the spectrum in conversation. As William Buckley is a conservative commentator and was for a very, very long time. Baldwin, who is not a commentator on politics necessarily, but on the kind of relations and experience. So as I said before, I think he felt that all he could do was right, and that's all he ever wanted to do. And the speaking engagements that he does is not really something that he's super comfortable with. He does it, and he likes to have conversations with people, but I think only if they're honest. And you can see this if you go to listen to any of Baldwin's interviews or anything, and you can tell when somebody isn't being honest, and he is just so annoyed the fact that they're trying to play somebody that they're not. So I think he just saw himself as a writer, and that's all he could do.
And how did Baldwin portray himself, and was he ultimately successful?
I think he wanted to portray himself in the most honest way possible, and that's a really cliche answer, but I think he was able to wanted to showcase himself as honestly as possible through the Black experience. He wanted people to know what was the Black experience. He wanted people to know, how do I define the Black experience and what is the reality of living as a Black man. I think he was successful in the way that he tried to portray himself, but I don't think that he was successful in portraying himself all the way honestly, because he still was not able to discuss his sexuality, which is something that very clearly at the very end of his life he connects to very, very much. And he connects really later on in his life is again when he starts talking about being a gay black man in America and how that contributes to his identity. And to be honest, there's more to be studied in that. And I knew that my project and my analysis only could, without it becoming an overwhelming like book, really manuscript, like it really needed to only tackle one aspect, and that one aspect was, looking at how Paris and living abroad affected his black identity. But really, there's way more to be studied about his gay identity and how that impacts him. So I think that Baldwin was able to portray himself honestly as a black man, but I also don't think that he wanted to portray himself as a this massive activist. He wanted to portray himself as a writer. He was not, even in interviews and discussions, like people will say, well, you're protesting against this. And he says, I'm not protesting. I'm just writing. If you take it as protest, that is your prerogative, but I'm writing. This is how I feel. And he was never afraid to comment on anything that people would talk to him about. I think he was honest in those ways.
And as we wrap up our conversation on Baldwin, is there anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to share with the audience?
You did two very beautiful episodes on James Baldwin, in part because I kept asking you to. And I kept saying, when's the Baldwin episode going to come out? And you finally did it a few months ago. That might have been a year ago now. But so your listeners, after they listen to this, need to go listen to those, because I think it'll actually give a really good context to everything we're talking about here. And you represented Baldwin very well, I think. So your listeners need to go over there and listen to that. But outside of that, and the promotional pieces, I think the ultimate argument that I made was that James Baldwin living in Europe changed the way he thought about America, changed the way he thought about his American identity, and that all of these texts, so the texts in order are Notes of a Native Son, Nobody Knows My Name, The Fire Next Time, the Maya Angelou and James Baldwin conversation, and then finally the I Am Not Your Negro documentary, and all of them connect together. They connect together to argue the idea that James Baldwin going to Europe helps him very closely understand who he was as a black man, helps him very closely understand how he felt he was himself. It connected him closer to his American identity, I think. And it's why he, at the very end of his life, he lives in America. And that's why he calls himself a transatlantic commuter, which I absolutely love, because really tries not to connect himself to America too much, but he just can't help himself at the very end. And that Paris in particular, he lives in other places in Europe, but he ultimately, by the end of his life, I think really understood that who he was represented by his family, was represented by the ancestors that had helped him come before. And I really want to hit on that, because he really wants people to understand that even though he has this relationship with America, he still always wants to acknowledge the people that helped him get here, the Baldwin name, and he really acknowledges that. So Paris, Europe helps develop who he was, and helps develop him as a black man, and then ultimately as a queer black man later on, when he's finally comfortable enough to talk about that. That's James Baldwin. I'm happy to share any of the essays or analysis with anybody, but I think this is an important topic. And as I said earlier, like working in early America, I knew that this was something that I needed to talk about, because I love James Baldwin. He really is a big part of my life. He's somebody that we have frequent conversations about. My wife and I particularly love James Baldwin, and we have conversations about him often. And he's somebody who, as a teacher teaching the civil rights movement, I always bring him up, always, because nobody knows his name, as the title suggests, right? And once students hear about him, I think they have a deeper appreciation for him, and trying to get students out of just seeing the civil rights movement as merely a Martin Luther King or Malcolm X centered piece. And that's not to say I don't talk about them, because I absolutely do. But as you very well know, in the stuff that you write, that at the very end of the day, it's the people are the ones that really begin the protests, the people who are the ones that really start that origin. And I think Baldwin is part of that ultimately. So he's one of the reasons why I'm did this project, and one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about him.
And so you mentioned if people wanted to get a peek at your analysis that they could reach out to you. So how can people find you and learn more about you and your scholarship?
Well, I'm on Twitter, or X. It's still Twitter to me, damn it. Um, so I'm on Twitter at Ethan P. Healey. Very simple, and that's mostly where you can find me. That's probably where you should go to find me. And we can. I'm happy to exchange anything over the DMs and give emails and whatever. But yeah, I mean, Twitter is mostly a place of it's less about scholarship now, which is why I joined it, and more about just ranting and venting at this point. So, but that's where they can find me if they want to find me.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Ethan, for coming on. I think it's always a good conversation when we're talking about James Baldwin. As you know, I've done a couple of episodes, and I have some deep reverence for the writer. And it was a wonderful time to chat with you and see kind of what analysis you brought to the table. So, thank you, Ethan.
Thank you very much.
And there you have it, folks. Thanks again to Ethan for coming onto the show and sharing his scholarship with me. I hope you all come back next Wednesday for yet another bonus episode. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you Saturday. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.